There is something running on your Windows computer right now that Microsoft did not ask your permission to enable. Not a virus, not malware installed by a stranger, something Microsoft itself quietly activated through a routine update. Something buried so deep inside Windows settings that the vast majority of users will never find it without specific instructions. Something that has been collecting data about your behavior, your habits, your usage patterns, and your activity since the moment that update installed itself on your machine. And here's the part that makes this worse than it sounds on the surface. This isn't a new capability Microsoft built and announced. This is a capability that already existed inside Windows, sitting dormant, that Microsoft chose to switch on remotely through an update without prominently notifying users it was happening. They didn't send you an email. They didn't show you a consent screen. They didn't give you a clear opt-in choice with plain language explaining what was being enabled. They just turned it on. The discovery spread across the internet within days of researchers and technically sophisticated users noticing behavioral changes in Windows telemetry after a routine update cycle. Privacy-focused communities erupted. Cybersecurity researchers began publishing technical documentation. The mainstream tech press picked up the story. And now, millions of Windows users are waking up to the reality that their operating system has been doing something they didn't know about, didn't agree to, and in many cases would actively object to if they understood it clearly. Here's exactly what was enabled. Here's exactly what it is collecting. Here's exactly why Microsoft's justification doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Here's why regulators are paying attention again. And here is the step-by-step process for disabling it right now, before another data collection cycle runs on your machine. What was quietly switched on? To understand what Microsoft enabled, you need to understand how Windows telemetry and activity tracking systems are actually architected, because Microsoft has built an extraordinarily complex infrastructure inside Windows for monitoring and reporting user behavior, and most of it operates entirely below the visible surface of the operating system. Windows has contained telemetry features since Windows 10. Microsoft has always been open about this at the broadest level, noting in privacy documentation that Windows collects diagnostic data to improve the product. For years, this framing allowed the data collection to exist with relatively limited public attention because the framing suggested routine system diagnostics, crash reports, performance metrics, the kind of anonymous aggregate data that most people, when presented with that description, don't find objectionable. What Microsoft quietly re-enabled through recent update infrastructure is substantially different from diagnostic telemetry in its scope and specificity. The feature is part of Windows-connected user experiences and telemetry service, but specifically the behavioral data collection layer within it that records and transmits granular information about user activity patterns, not whether your system crashed, not aggregate hardware performance, specific behavioral data, which applications you open and how frequently, how long you spend in each application, what times of day you use your computer most actively, how you navigate between applications, the sequence and pattern of your computing behavior across sessions. Additionally, the reactivated tracking intersects with Windows Advertising Identifier System, which assigns each Windows installation a unique ID that Microsoft uses to build cross-application behavioral profiles for advertising targeting purposes. The advertising identifier had been navigable to and disableable through Windows privacy settings. What the recent change affected is the frequency and depth of data being collected against that identifier, and critically, it reset the advertising identifier's active status for users who had previously adjusted settings, quietly restoring data collection that those users had deliberately chosen to stop. Security researcher and privacy analyst firm Researchers, who first documented the change, published detailed packet capture analysis showing the volume and destination of data transmissions after the update compared to before. The difference was not subtle. The telemetry traffic volume increase was measurable, consistent, and directly attributable to the update in question. The destination servers were Microsoft's data collection infrastructure. The timing aligned exactly with the update deployment window. This was not a researcher's theoretical concern about what Microsoft could collect. This was documented evidence of what Microsoft was actually transmitting from real machines after flipping a switch they didn't publicly announce they were flipping: the architecture of invisible tracking. Most Windows users have a vague awareness that their computer sends data to Microsoft. Most have seen the settings screens that reference diagnostic data, privacy options, and telemetry levels. Most assume, reasonably, that the settings they chose during Windows setup or in privacy configurations represent the actual state of what their computer is doing. That assumption is where Microsoft's architecture and Microsoft's user-facing transparency diverge in ways that are deeply uncomfortable when examined closely. Windows settings screens present a simplified, user-facing representation of privacy controls. They show toggles that appear to represent binary states: diagnostic data on or off, personalized advertising on or off, activity history on or off. The presentation implies that changing these settings comprehensively controls the underlying data collection behavior. The technical reality of how Windows telemetry actually operates is significantly more layered. The user-facing settings interact with some components of the telemetry infrastructure but don't address others. The Windows-connected user experiences and telemetry service, which operates as a Windows system service with elevated privileges, functions partially independently of the user-accessible settings toggles. Certain data collection behaviors are classified at the system level as required for Windows operation and are therefore not subject to user-level settings controls at all. Updates can and do change the behavior of these underlying systems in ways that don't prompt corresponding changes in the user-facing settings display. The toggle can appear in the same position you left it while the underlying behavior the toggle is supposed to represent has changed beneath it. This architecture creates a specific kind of deception that is difficult to characterize charitably. It's not that Microsoft is lying outright about what the settings do. It's that the settings interface creates an impression of control and transparency that the underlying system architecture doesn't actually deliver. Users interact with a control panel that suggests comprehensive privacy management, while the actual collection infrastructure operates at a level they can't see, and with a scope the control panel doesn't fully reflect. The recently activated tracking layer operates within this architecture. It sits below the level of controls that most users know to look for. It was switched on through a system update mechanism, the same mechanism users are told they should keep enabled for security reasons, in a way that bypassed the expectation most users have that their existing settings choices would be respected. This is why privacy researchers describe this not just as aggressive data collection, but as a trust violation. The issue isn't only what is being collected. The issue is the method. Using a security update delivery mechanism to quietly restore and expand data collection that users had adjusted or disabled is the kind of action that, if described plainly to users, most would find flatly unacceptable. What Microsoft says, and why it doesn't hold up. Microsoft's official position on Windows telemetry and data collection has remained consistent across years of scrutiny, and it rests on a framework of justifications that sound reasonable in isolation and become increasingly difficult to accept as a complete picture when examined alongside the actual behavior. Justification 1. The data improves Windows. Microsoft maintains that behavioral and usage data collected from Windows devices informs product development, helps identify bugs and performance issues, and allows Microsoft to prioritize improvements that reflect how users actually use the operating system. This is a real and legitimate use case for telemetry data. It's genuinely true that aggregate usage data can improve software. The problem is that this justification describes a narrow use case for a data collection system that goes significantly beyond what that justification requires. You do not need an advertising identifier tied to individual user behavioral patterns across applications over time to fix a driver compatibility bug. The scope of what Microsoft collects is not proportionate to the diagnostic improvement justification they invoke to defend it. Justification 2. It's disclosed in the privacy policy. Microsoft's privacy policy and supporting documentation do describe the data collection programs at length, in detail, in language that is technically accurate. The privacy policy runs to thousands of words across multiple linked documents. It is comprehensive in the sense that a determined reader who spent several hours working through interconnected policy documents could, in principle, construct an understanding of what Windows collects. This is compliance theater. Disclosure that is technically present but practically inaccessible to the users. It's supposed to inform is not meaningful transparency. It is the legal minimum dressed as ethical behavior. Justification? 3. Users can control their data through settings. As described above, the settings interface provides an impression of control that the underlying technical architecture doesn't fully deliver. This justification requires users to trust that the settings they see accurately represent the behavior they're managing. The recently activated tracking component, re-enabled through an update that overrode previous user settings choices, is the direct empirical refutation of this justification. The settings said one thing. The system was doing something else. Justification 4. The data is anonymized. Microsoft's claims about data anonymization are difficult to independently verify because the anonymization processes are not publicly auditable. Privacy researchers have repeatedly demonstrated, across multiple companies and data collection programs, that behavioral data tied to a persistent device identifier can be re-identified through pattern analysis even when traditional personally identifying information is removed. The concept of truly anonymous behavioral data collected over time at the granularity Microsoft describes has been challenged by academic privacy researchers with enough technical evidence to make confident claims of anonymization implausible at minimum. None of these justifications is entirely fabricated. Each contains a genuine element, What makes them inadequate is the combination of scope, opacity, implementation method, and the specific behavior at issue here, which is re-enabling data collection through an update mechanism in a way that overrides users' previous settings choices. Why regulators are paying attention. Again, Microsoft's relationship with privacy regulators has been complicated for years. The recall scandal brought intense multi-jurisdictional scrutiny that has not fully resolved. The revelation that Microsoft quietly re-enabled expanded tracking through a system update has dropped directly into that already active regulatory environment. The timing could not be worse for Microsoft from a regulatory perspective. European data protection authorities, already engaged with Microsoft on recall-related inquiries, received this new information while their existing investigations were still ongoing. Regulatory inquiries compound in ways that are significantly worse than their individual components. A single privacy concern can be investigated, addressed, and closed. Multiple concurrent concerns, particularly when they share a thematic pattern of Microsoft enabling data collection without clear user consent, suggest to regulators a systemic disposition rather than isolated incidents. The systemic framing is the dangerous one. When regulators conclude that a company has a systemic pattern of privacy violations, they don't respond with targeted fixes. They respond with structural requirements, ongoing oversight, and penalties calibrated to create behavior change rather than simply punish specific incidents. That category of regulatory response is what Microsoft is now risking as its privacy incidents accumulate. The German Federal Commissioner for Data Protection, who had already issued statements on recall, responded to the tracking discovery with renewed urgency. German data protection culture has zero tolerance for software that re-enables data collection over users' explicit settings choices. The principle that user settings should be respected, that a company cannot simply update its way around privacy choices users have made, is foundational to the GDPR framework. The GDPR's consent requirements are explicit. Consent for personal data processing must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. It must be as easy to withdraw as to give. Enabling data collection through a system update that restores collection that users had disabled is, under a straightforward reading of GDPR consent requirements, a consent violation. The UK ICO's parallel inquiry received additional documentation from the tracking discovery. The pattern of inquiries across EU member states, already open, now has additional specific evidence to examine. In the United States, the FTC's increasingly active stance on digital privacy enforcement means this disclosure arrives at a moment of heightened regulatory sensitivity. Multiple state attorneys general have open matters with Microsoft on privacy issues. The Washington State Attorney General's office, in Microsoft's home state, has been particularly active on technology privacy questions. Adding documented evidence of a quietly enabled tracking system to an already complex regulatory picture is not a minor complication for Microsoft's legal teams. The cumulative regulatory picture building around Microsoft's privacy practices represents a qualitatively different threat than any single inquiry. Companies can navigate individual investigations. Companies that develop a reputation across regulatory communities as serial privacy violators face a different category of risk. The enterprise fallout is already starting. Consumer privacy concerns generate headlines and user frustration. Enterprise privacy concerns generate contract reviews, legal assessments, and procurement decisions. The hidden tracker discovery has triggered all three in measurable ways. Corporate IT departments operate under a specific obligation that individual consumer users do not. When personal data belonging to employees, or more significantly to customers, clients, or patients moves through or is processed on corporate systems, companies have legal obligations that attach to that data. Those obligations don't disappear because the data movement is happening through an operating system's telemetry system rather than through a visible application. The legal question that Enterprise Customers Council is now evaluating is whether Windows behavioral tracking, specifically the recently re-enabled collection layer, is compatible with their data handling obligations under relevant regulations. For healthcare organizations subject to HIPAA, this question has direct operational implications. For financial institutions subject to banking regulations governing data handling, this question is not academic. For law firms dealing with attorney-client privileged communications, the question of whether usage patterns on firm computers are being transmitted to Microsoft raises concerns that are serious on their face. Chief information officers at companies in sensitive industries are now requesting comprehensive audits of Windows telemetry configuration across their organizations. Legal teams are issuing guidance to IT departments to evaluate and document current Windows data collection settings. Procurement reviewers at several large enterprises have opened formal reviews of Microsoft agreements that include language governing data processing. This enterprise response will not produce dramatic, immediate results. Enterprise technology decisions operate on long cycles, but the evaluation process is now underway will produce decisions, and those decisions will increasingly factor in Microsoft's demonstrated willingness to re-enable data collection through update mechanisms as a risk consideration. The risk calculus has changed. CIOs who previously treated Windows telemetry as a known and managed background factor are now reassessing how manageable it actually is when Microsoft can update deploy changes that override organizational settings configurations. That reassessment doesn't have a comfortable landing point for Microsoft. The pattern. Microsoft cannot explain away. Step back from the specific technical details of this particular tracking re-enablement and look at the pattern it fits into. Because the pattern is the actual story here. Windows 11 launched with hardware requirements that forced users toward newer machines and deeper Microsoft ecosystem dependency. Windows 11 required Microsoft account integration that connected user identities to Microsoft's data infrastructure. Windows 11 began surfacing advertising and operating system interfaces. Windows 11 shipped Recall, which screenshotted everything on users' screens into an unencrypted database. And now Windows 11 has been updated to quietly re-enable behavioral tracking that users had previously adjusted or disabled. These are not independent incidents. They are a coherent pattern. Each element reflects the same underlying strategic orientation. An operating system that increasingly treats its users as a data source and advertising audience rather than as customers whose computing experience should be its primary product. The direction of travel is unmistakable. Each update cycle brings Windows further from a tool that serves users and closer to a platform that extracts value from users. The data collection expands. The advertising integration deepens. The user control over the operating system's behavior narrows. The settings interfaces maintain the appearance of user agency, while the underlying infrastructure operates increasingly independently of users' choices. Microsoft's executives, if asked directly, would reject this characterization entirely. They would describe Windows as a product under active improvement, AI-enhanced, security-hardened, and increasingly capable. They would present each individual element of the pattern as having a distinct, individually defensible justification. Better telemetry for better improvement. Advertising offset by free services. AI features requiring connectivity and data processing. The problem with that individual element defense is that users don't experience Windows as a collection of individually justified features. They experience it as a coherent platform. And the coherent experience that platform is delivering increasingly feels like being managed, monitored, and monetized by an operating system they thought they owned. Bill Gates did not build Microsoft by treating users as a resource to be extracted from. He built it by treating users as customers to be served. The distance between those two orientations is the distance between the Microsoft that made Windows dominant and the Microsoft that is currently watching users defect to Linux over privacy and autonomy concerns. That Gates is reportedly stunned by the trajectory of the platform he built is, if anything, an understatement of what watching this pattern unfold should produce in anyone who understands what Windows once represented. How to disable it, right now. You don't have to wait for Microsoft to reverse this. You don't have to trust that a future update will clean it up. You can take direct action right now to disable the tracking components that were quietly re-enabled on your machine. Here's exactly how to do it. First, you need to address the advertising identifier. Open Windows settings by pressing Windows key and the letter I together. Navigate to Privacy and Security. Select General. You will see a toggle labeled Let Apps Show Me Personalized Ads by using my advertising ID. Turn this off. This disables the advertising identifier-based targeting, though it does not eliminate the identifier itself. Second, address the diagnostic data settings. Staying in Privacy and Security, scroll down to Diagnostics and Feedback. You will see options for diagnostic data collection level. Set this to the minimum option available, which is labeled Send Required Diagnostic Data. Do not leave it on optional diagnostic data. The optional level is what enables the expanded behavioral collection. Also within this section, turn off the toggle for improved inking and typing. Turn off the toggle for tailored experiences. These options feed behavioral data into Microsoft's personalization and advertising infrastructure. Third, address activity history. Still in Privacy and Security, select Activity History. Turn off Store My Activity History on this device. If you see an option referencing sending activity history to Microsoft, ensure that is also turned off. Clear your existing activity history using the Clear button if it appears. Fourth, address the connected user experiences and telemetry service at the system level, which requires a slightly more technical step, but is accessible to most users. Press Windows key and R together to open the Run dialog. Type Services. MSC and press Enter. This opens the Windows Services Manager. Scroll down to find Connected User Experiences and Telemetry. Right-click on it. Select Properties. In the Startup Type dropdown, change it from Automatic to Disabled. Click Apply. Click Stop to stop the currently running service. Click OK. This disables the primary service responsible for behavioral telemetry collection at the system level. Fifth, use Group Policy Editor if you have Windows 11 Pro or Enterprise. Press Windows key and R, type gpedit. MSC, press Enter. Navigate to Computer Configuration, then Administrative Templates, then Windows Components, then Data Collection and Preview Builds. Find the policy labeled Allow Diagnostic Data. Set it to Disabled. This provides a system-level policy enforcement of telemetry restriction that is more resilient to being overridden by future updates than user-level settings changes alone. Sixth, consider using a dedicated privacy hardening tool. Third-party tools, including O&O Shutup 10++, which is free, and WPD Privacy Dashboard, provide comprehensive interfaces for reviewing and disabling Windows telemetry, data collection, and tracking settings in one place, including settings that are not easily accessible through the standard Windows settings interface. These tools allow you to audit your current privacy configuration and apply hardening settings systematically, rather than hunting through nested menus. Seventh, and this is critical, understand that future Windows updates can and have reversed some of these settings. The fact that Microsoft re-enabled tracking through an update means that your settings choices are not permanently protected against update-based restoration. After each major Windows update, revisit these settings to confirm they remain in the configuration you chose. Check whether the connected user experiences and telemetry service has been re-enabled. Check whether diagnostic data settings have been reset. Make verifying your privacy settings after updates a standard part of your Windows maintenance routine. This is not a comfortable instruction to have to give. The fact that users must perform ongoing vigilance against their own operating system's updates, reversing their privacy choices, is itself an indictment of how Microsoft has designed the system. A trustworthy operating system would respect settings choices persistently. The fact that this guide has to include a step about rechecking after updates tells you everything you need to know about whether Microsoft is treating your privacy choices as authoritative or as temporary obstacles. Where this stands right now, Microsoft has not issued a comprehensive public response acknowledging the specific tracking re-enablement in the direct terms that the situation warrants. Their communications on Windows privacy continue to reference commitment to user control and transparency in language that has become actively jarring against the backdrop of what their update infrastructure has actually been doing. Regulatory inquiries are active and expanding. The accumulated pattern of privacy incidents is shaping how regulators characterize Microsoft's overall disposition toward user data, and that characterization is shifting in a direction that carries real enforcement risk. Enterprise customers are in active evaluation mode. Legal and IT departments across industries handling sensitive data are reassessing whether Windows' current telemetry architecture is compatible with their compliance obligations, and that assessment is unlikely to consistently conclude in Microsoft's favor. Consumer trust in Windows is at historic lows, and the Linux migration is accelerating. Every revelation like this one adds momentum to the argument, now increasingly accepted by mainstream users who would never have considered it 2 years ago, that there is a viable alternative and that the reasons for choosing it are compelling and growing. Microsoft can fix this. The technical ability to genuinely give users persistent, update-proof control over their data collection settings exists. The ability to deploy that control through an update is precisely demonstrated by the fact that Microsoft used update infrastructure to expand collection. The same mechanism could be used to genuinely reduce it. That choice requires a strategic reorientation that prioritizes users over data extraction revenue, which is a real financial trade-off that Microsoft's current leadership has not shown willingness to make. Until they make it, every Windows update is a potential privacy incident. Every routine patch cycle is an occasion for users to check whether Microsoft has quietly changed something else. Every system update that installs silently is something to verify against privacy settings that might have been quietly reset. That is the relationship Microsoft has built with its users, not through malice, through accumulated strategic choices that treated user data as an asset and user privacy settings as a soft boundary. Bill Gates built Windows to put a computer in your hands, a computer that was yours, that belonged to you, that you controlled. Microsoft in 2025 is building something different, an operating system that sits between you and your computer, collecting, transmitting, and monetizing data about everything you do on it, while maintaining just enough surface-level privacy controls to maintain the appearance of user agency. The hidden tracker they just re-enabled without asking is not the last one. Disable it now, check again after the next update. And ask yourself honestly whether the company that keeps quietly re-enabling things you turned off deserves the trust that running an operating system on your machine requires, because that trust is the one thing no settings menu can restore after it's broken. And Microsoft keeps breaking it.